Evolutionary.org, Hardcore 2.0, episode 70 coming your way. Today we're going to talk about a really important one. It's going to be high concentrations injections 2024 with Para Pharma. So we're going to do something that no other podcast out there does and talk about this stuff. We're going to talk about the science. We're going to go under the hood and talk about the stuff because like all these other podcasts, they don't talk about this stuff. They don't really educate you guys about this stuff. And Mobster and I, we research this stuff and we bring it to you. And a lot of the stuff that we're researching is new information for 2024 that's not out there. And this is going to save you money. It's going to save you a headache about injecting. It's going to educate you on why sometimes when you inject certain gear, it hurts and other times it doesn't hurt. This way, there's no surprises. And this way you can get the most out of your cycles, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to save you guys money. We're trying to save you guys headaches so you can be successful at this. So we're going to get over all this, and we're going to talk about why some injectables hurt more than others. We're going to talk about some examples of oils that they use with steroids. We're going to talk about blends, why they can be better and why they can not be better than single options. We're going to talk about tips to lower post-injection pain, PIP. We're going to talk about the ParaPharma high concentration options and how to use them. And we're going to talk about why ParaPharma is really becoming more and more popular every day and why we love them. This is going to be a great podcast. So I have Mobster here, and we're going to get right into it. So let's start with why some injectables hurt more than others. So first off, the obvious thing is you're piercing your skin with a thin metal tube. So typically, 90 to 95% of the time, you're going to be using a 25 gauge 1-inch needle. That's going to be the standard when it comes to injecting. I've used 23 gauge back in the day when I was injecting Primo. And back in those days, 15 years ago, it was hard to find a lot of options with Primo. So the Primo I would order it internationally. It'd be the Bear Primo. And that stuff was thick, Mobster. It was like motor oil. And that stuff was hard. Like, you try to draw that oil out with a 23 gauge and it was hard enough. So forget about using a 25 gauge. I had to use a 23 gauge, not just, but obviously you want to use a thick gauge to draw. The lower the number, the thicker the gauge. So I would use like an 18-inch to draw because it was so hard to draw it. And then I would inject with a 25 gauge, and that would really irritate the crap out of me. The post-injection pain was horrifically bad with that stuff. But here's why, and we're going to get into that in a second. But the bottom line is, you got to remember, the pharmaceutical companies that are coming up with this gear, they're coming up with it for medical reasons, for pharmaceutical reasons. So they're not expecting you to load up a 3cc syringe like I was doing to pin 100 milligrams a milliliter of Primo. So even though the Primo was only 100 milligram a milliliter, it had an incredible amount of post-injection pain. But again, they're only expecting people to inject half a cc or 1cc max.
Yes.
They're not expecting you to load up a 3cc. So of course it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt triply when you inject 3 times as much. So that's part of it. Nowadays, and I'll let Mobster talk about this. Mobster, explain Underground Labs, how they've kind of helped out with that, and talk a little bit more about the Rich Piana story.
Yeah, I'll start with the Rich Piana story first, Steve, because we've used this particular story on a similar show some years ago. As Steve says, we're bringing this stuff up today. So Rich Piana is one of his more sensible, why things are the way that they are kind of videos, is sitting down by the pier, I'm guessing somewhere on the Californian coast. And he comes up with this idea, this notion, which made a lot of sense. He said, look, steroids, like Stevesmi already said, were invented for medical reasons for the most part. And as Steve again has just talked about, the sheer amounts that were being put in for medical reasons are far, far less than the amounts that are put in for performance enhancement, for muscularity, for strength, for whatever reason you're taking it for. It's not, when we're having this podcast, most of it is not talking about a medical issue. It is for aesthetics, it's for strength and so on. So he says, look, they would have had, all the pharmaceutical companies, hundreds of thousands of users, millions, maybe, Steve, of users, and multiple companies producing different steroidal products to treat different medical conditions. And out of those hundreds of thousands, if not millions of users, there was never a case that we saw that we could think of or that they even bothered to experiment with. But there may well have been, I'm going to guess, perhaps, although we haven't got access to that information at this time, a few examples where perhaps they did try more milligrams per milliliter and realized that it did not make the medical condition go away any quicker. So that's number one, right? You have literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even a million users of steroids for medical reasons, and you never saw 350, 400, 450, 500. You certainly never saw the fours and the fives, never, because these people would have been in pain, and then you're having to treat them for something else, and they might not want to take the injections. They might refuse the injections, and so on and so forth, and you'll try to treat them for medical reasons. So that was number one. So the second part of that, in terms of the money, and let's be honest, when we talk about big pharma, we're talking about the money, especially in America, but even one of the biggest companies in this country, Steve, in terms of the hundreds of billions of dollars worth, is a medical company. And quite simply, it's not a money thing. The idea that big pharma makes money is there's no argument. So let's imagine that they're selling steroids to make money. Well, it costs them, they can just charge you double. If instead of giving you 250 milligrams a mil, they can put 500 milligrams in a mil and just charge you the same as the 250 per milligram. In other words, 250 milligrams, let's say it costs $10, well, then they would just charge you $20. They're not going to lose a buck. In fact, if anything, they're going to get out of the way to make more money. So it's not about saving a penny. It's not about economics. It's just going to come down to comfort or discomfort for the individual being used. And that made a lot of sense to me, Steve. There was almost no argument. You can't think of any reason why it'd be any different. But again, that's medical. So like Steve says, and I can actually tell a side story to go with this, Steve, the sheer volume of liquid. And the side story is thus, I'm called to the counter at the gym, and the gym owner is almost, come over, I want to tell you something. And I go, what's going on? And we point at some young man at the front of the gym. I've never seen him before. I'm going to say he's in his early 20s, Steve, and he says he's just injected his first ever injection, 4 milliliters, so something ridiculous like 1,200 milligrams, maybe 1,000, maybe 1,200 milligrams, depends on how much was in it, into his quad. I said, well, we won't see him again. He's going to be, if it's literally his first injection, Steve, ever, and he's put 4 milliliters in, so 4 cc's into his quad. You know he's going to be walking around, he's going to be hobbling, he's going to hate the fact that he's had an injection, etc., etc. And it's just like, why didn't he split it up? What the fuck was he thinking? Why is he in such a goddamn rush? And just a bunch of things like that. So you go, okay. I mean, people have made mistakes, as Steve was referring to syringes earlier on. We literally did a podcast, I think it was early last week, when a top professional bodybuilder now, I think he's only just retired from the sport, made the mistake of not knowing that he needed what size of needle that he used, what syringe to buy, having to go to a vet suppliers and pretend that he was getting syringes for a dog, didn't realize he could buy them on Amazon or eBay, as you can now, and all these kind of stories. So there's a bunch of reasons why literally just the injection can hurt. I've even talked about this, Steve. Instead of being old, cat-candid, stiff motherfucker as I become, the problem that I was getting with post-injection pain did not relate at all to the volumes of milligrams per milliliter, but the simple fact that for me to inject my quad, which is one of my favorite sites, I was having almost to lean over to the side, and I was never quite holding the needle, the syringe, etc., dead level all the time I'm injecting, and eventually worked out how to do it because I hadn't done an injection for a while. And it was me moving the needle around inside the fucking muscle that was causing me most injection pain, not the product. So that was just poor injection technique and not understanding needle gauge sizes and all that kind of stuff. But what we're really talking about today, and this goes back to the Rich Piana story, is more what goes into a steroid for you to inject for performance enhancement purposes, whether it's literally the oils, the benzoyl alcohol content, but more specifically, and we're going to deal with all these aspects, the milligrams per milliliter, and the reasons why, as Steve said, some cause more issues than others. We will touch upon the other facets to give you some tips and techniques that will help, but specifically the main focus of the day is the milligrams per milliliter and why it, to put it crudely, Steve, fucking stings. So that's
Yeah.
the meat and potatoes of where we're going to.
So let's talk about different oils that are used with anabolic steroids. So, you know, uh, you know, 5, 10 years ago, underground labs were
Yeah.
dominating the American market. Most of the gear was produced by some dude in his basement, and we had really bad quality gear that was coming out 5, 10 years ago. Now, obviously, it's improved. Companies, brands like ParaPharma have replaced those. A lot of those guys are, ironically, have been, taken off the market,
Yep.
in
Yep.
for several reasons. Either they took themselves out or they were taken out, if you know what I mean. So ironically, that's worked out well for brands like ParaPharma that actually produce legitimate underground gear in an actual pharmaceutical setting. So what are
Yes.
some oils that are used now? Cottonseed oil, sesame seed oil, grapeseed oil, those are the ones that I've heard over the years. I've heard some underground labs using peanut oil, which Lobster and I were
Yeah.
discussing on the pre-show, which is pretty
Yeah.
stupid because a lot of people out there are allergic to peanut oil. I know some of the underground labs back in the day were using CSO, which was the cottonseed oil. You heard that a lot. That seemed to be the preferred one, and that seemed to really work well at reducing post-injection pain or keeping it down low.
Yeah.
So, Mobster, get into why blends are better than single test form. This is one of your notes.
Yeah, let me touch on the whole thing for just for a second here, Steve. If you're a professional company, regardless of whether we call you an underground lab or not, as Steve said, the more and more of these companies, like ParaPharma, are pharmaceutical companies that all but name. They have labs, they have testing, they have the special scales, they have the production line set up. Every single thing that you think, it's not kitchen sink operation; it's a pharmaceutical operation. They're just licensed or unlicensed, Stephen. In fact, some countries they're licensed, in other countries they're not. But they are a pharmaceutical companies and all but name, and it makes the most sense to use, even if it costs them an extra buck, the least likely to cause issue oil versus trying to save a buck and use oils that might be a little bit cheaper but will sting for some people, and so on and so forth. Like Steve said, the idea that people using peanut oil is absolutely crazy, right? So the whole business with blends, and it's kind of weird, Steve, right? The blends tend to be multiple esters, and we're going to touch upon the esters as well. So, for example, one of my favorite blends is Sustanon. A Sustanon, as Steve's described in multiple shows, when I've agreed with him when we talked about this, is a combination of short, medium, and long acting esters. And the reality of the situation when it comes to that is that the shorter esters, propionate and above, it's ACE, for example, and so on and so forth, versus the longer esters, tend to cause more issues. The way that they're being created in a lab, the chemical structure tends to, for whatever reason, which I completely don't understand the science of, Steve, sting more than a longer acting ester. And we've talked about this on shows when we go, if it's not a time restricted issue, then you can change that. Steve's saying that for him, sustenance causes PIP in him, which means he would be sensitive to the shorter ester. I've never had any post-injection pain with Sustanon. But then, of course, it's also the ratios that is in there, Steve, of the products. And we know that, for example, most labs produce products where the ratios are very similar to the next company. You might see a 5 or 10 milligram deviation one way or another. But for the most part, it's a certain formula that seems to work. Of the short, it'd be this amount, the medium this amount, the longer acting esters this amount. What you will occasionally see, and we have talked about this on the show before, is that we've gone, oh, okay, there's a 5 milligram difference there or a 10 milligram difference there. But for the sake of argument, they're more or less the same ratios every single time. And of course, it's because a very popular product produced as it was by a pharmaceutical company back in the day that works incredibly well for the purposes that we're using it for now, Steve. An obvious one again would be, for example, any kind of blend, and I've even used a blend for this myself, where we know, for example, Steve, and this is not really a post-injection pain issue as such, where you are using trend, which can come with side effects. And for example, when we talk about post-injection pain, well, we can also talk about test flu. We could also talk about inflammation. We can talk about even, for example, why would we use a blend when we can buy a single source product? But that's literally a case of the reason why we have high volume milligram per mil products. And it comes down to the simple fact of we'd be doing multiple injections. versus only needing to do one injection. Talk about the reason why you think, Steve, that you had sustanon post-injection pain versus, for example, me not having it.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think it was the testosterone propionate, just a small amount that was in there that probably caused it. So, um, what's interesting, about that is whatever blend you take, it's always going to be a little more painful than a single compound oil-based solution. So the reason is higher concentration of alcohol in the vial. So it's used to keep the different compounds in the blend in proper condition. So usually the more BA, which is the benzyl alcohol product, contains, the more it hurts. So, other reasons, Mobster, you mentioned allergic reactions. Look, that counts. That causes post-injection pain, even though it's a little different. That's basically your own body reacting to what's being put into it. And even just, as we said earlier, having this thing put into our muscle can cause your body to be like, oh my gosh, and react to that. There's something called tissue irritation.
Yeah.
And I've had that before.
It's a foreign body, Steve. It's a foreign body, and the body's just not ready for it to be there. Even, and I just touch on the alcohol issue for a second. What sometimes we used to see in the past is that they would put benzyl alcohol in to help with the suspension, as you said, but also this was a control against bacterial issues. Now, of course, the quality's gone up, as we talked about. Equally, if the ratio of benzyl alcohol was slightly off, and I mean a tiny fraction, listeners, because it really is a very small part of what's gone into the product. If the ratio was a tiny bit off, you wouldn't get much pain, for example, if there's a 5 or 10 milligram difference in the amount of testosterone in a product. But if the alcohol ratio was a tiny bit off, it would sting more going in. Simple as that. Now, of course, what's happened, as I said earlier, Steve, is they've all become far more accurate with their dosages of what's gone into the product, and far better at using a better base oil so that it's the least allergic with the majority of users, and far better at controlling the ratio of benzyl alcohol. They're not fucking up, in other words, they're not accidentally putting too much in and then say, well, I can't really take it out, we'll sell it anyway. And just people are going to get a sting when they put it in, but they'll probably think it's working. That doesn't happen anymore. It really doesn't. Something that Steve and I talked about in the pre-show, and we'll expand on this as we go on, is that companies have got better. It used to be the case, as little as 10 years ago, Steve, that you would see way more complaints about post-injection pain, and occasionally we will see it now. But the ratio that we had in the past versus the ratio of complaints now is far less. And it's quite simply, but the labs that are producing these products, like ParaPharma, have got fucking good at doing what they do and getting the ratios right every single time. They're not making mistakes. They're not accidentally putting too much of something in or something else in. They're not causing problems. And so, for example, it would have been me just a short time ago saying, I don't understand the use of this, and when you're going to do this and you're going to do that. And we're going to get into that a little bit in terms of why have you bought this product if you know it's going to sting. It used to be the case that I was correct. It's now the case that they've got so much better at producing the products and making sure that the ratios are correct, that the frequency of people complaining about it, including myself, if I decided to use a high milligram per mil product, would be far less in terms of post-injection pain. And again, I'm a big fan of sustanon, and I don't get any issues with it. So yeah, let's move on, Steve, as you say.
So let's get into tips to lower post-injection pain, PIP. So first, any testosterone correctly concentrated at 400 milligram a milliliter or 500 milligram, et cetera, is generally going to have some PIP. And if you don't want that, just simply go with something less concentrated.
Yes.
Go with the 200 milligram milliliter, go with the 250, but it's not necessarily the case. We're talking about testosterone because I used the example earlier about Primo. And the Primo from Bayer came in 100 milligram a milliliter amp. And that caused horrific post-injection pain. So it's not just the fact that, just something with high concentrations are going to automatically cause PIP and things with low concentration won't, because it's just not the fact. And then also with Winstrol, same thing. Winstrol comes in 50 milligram a milliliter. And if you inject Winstrol, ask anybody who's done it, I've done it, and the post-injection pain is horrific with that. And, and that's just how it is. It's a water-based solution. So it's not necessarily that. But in this case, when it comes to testosterone specifically, that makes sense. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I would say generally speaking, that would be correct, Steve. Again, you've listen. Something that's super, super important is particularly regards us that we could have 100,000 listeners listening to this show, and 90,000 listeners will have zero issues every single time, and then 5% will have an issue now and again, and 5% will have an issue all the time. That's always going to be the case, and you can't sort of have a back and forth. But generally speaking, the information that we give across the board would be accurate. But there will be, as Steve said, specific products like Winstrol, water-based, like literally the concentrations, etc., etc. And one of the things I've said, and this is what I was kind of hinting at a little bit just now, Steve, when I was talking about it, was that for the most part, I never understood the point of buying a 400 milligram per mil product, or even 350, or even down as low as 300, but typically 350 and up, even up all the way up to 500, if you're going to dilute it. Because what have you done? You've saved a buck, maybe, because it's going to be cheaper overall. But then you've had to go out and buy oils, and then you're mixing it in the syringe in order to put it back into your body. Well, then you might as well have bought the 300 milligram or less product to begin with. I never understood that. But as I said just now, companies have got better with the higher dosage milligram per mil products. So it makes sense now, but it used to be the case before. Why buy it if it's going to sting, and then you're going to complain about it stinging? Either take it, let it sting, do what you got to do, get the results that you want, or don't buy it. That's literally come on you. And I'll touch on this now, Steve, but we'll talk about it again later on. Companies produced, especially even when it stung before, they produced what you wanted and what sold, not necessarily what would or wouldn't sting. You want a 400 milligram, we'll make it. Will it make you get the anabolic, etc. effects that you want? Yes, absolutely. Will you have to pin less? Yes, absolutely. But you're then going to say, but it stings. Well, that's kind of fucking obvious. Not every single time, but generally speaking, when we're doing this show, yes, that would be the case. Like I said, though, companies have got better with the right oils, with the right ratio of benzoyl alcohol, and just, not fucking up for the milligram per milliliter. They're just a lot better at producing a solid product every single time. So I would absolutely say years ago, Steve, I would have not deviated from the argument of using less concentrated of a product, but now I would say that you can use a higher concentrated product, certainly 350 milligrams, which in most cases used to sting, but no longer stings as much for the reasons I've talked about. So yeah, I mean, look, again, some of you will, some of you won't, but for the most part, it is generally speaking, the higher concentration would still be the case. Certainly 400 milligrams and up. But again, there are reasons why you might want to use that, which we'll get into. And the reasons are simply that you're less injection. You might be doing a composition thing. You might be doing multiple products, and therefore you'd end up, looking at 15 syringes or 7 or 8 syringes a day and all this kind of stuff, and that need to do certain things in order to sort of much easier to do 3 or 4 syringes, high volume per milligram, etc., for competition purposes. Steve, I certainly. I'm not going to ever compete in the point where I'm going to want to do multiple injections per day. And so the idea of a high volume thing to me, which it's going to sting, but it's one injection. Fantastic. Fuck it. That's what I'm going to do. But yeah, generally speaking, we're correct. Back
All
to
right,
you.
so let's talk about a couple other ways that we can help with post-injection pain manually. And one of them that I've used over the years is identify different oils, injectables, and whether it be Masteron or Equipoise or Deca or NPP, whatever, and mix in that steroid with the steroid. And that worked for me back in the day. As I mentioned to you, when I was using that Primo, that nasty, thick motor oil Primo, that's
Yep.
one of the tips that I got back then, and I started to do it, and it helped. So what I would do is I would take Deca and I would mix in 100 milligrams of Deca with 100 milligrams of Primo. So now you got 50% of each. I'd mix them in the same syringe, and then I would inject it. And that cut down on the PIP a lot. I didn't get rid of the PIP, but it made it bearable. Now, the problem was that with that is now you got to inject more gear. And, a lot of times you're like, shit, now I got to inject twice as much gear and it's already a pain in the ass to inject. So that's where it became a pain in the ass. And that's why I've never used that 100 milligram milliliter Primo ever again in my life, because I hate injecting, you see. So really, that's the third tip that I'll give you is, look, if it gives you PIP, just stop using it. You're going to figure out over time which steroids you react good to and which steroids
Yes.
you don't. And then if you
Yes.
don't, then simply don't use it. I don't know why people make such a big deal out of this. I
Let
think
me
the
let
pro
me
I
let me
think the
jump in for a
problem,
sec. Yeah,
yeah,
let me
but let
jump
me
in just
just
for a second. Listen, guys, right? In terms of what Steve's talking about, it used to be the case, and it's no longer the case, that we were restricted with what was available. That isn't the case anymore. Me and Steve can go on ParaPharma right now just on testosterone and find combinations thereof, amount of different milligrams per milliliter thereof, just on testosterone or variants of testosterone esters. Right now, back in the day, again, you were restricted. So the argument's always going to come down to, well, why do you do what you don't need to do, which hurts, when you can do something else? Back in the day, that argument was invalid because you go, well, this is all I fucking get. This is all the sources are made available. But now all of the approved sources, including ParaPharma, have multiple options. You do not need to do what is just available because there are other options available to you. You can, I mean, look, when we talk to people and they say, I've put together this cycle, and you go, okay, what's the aim of the cycle? Well, perhaps you could do it this way because some of what you're using is not perfect for the aim of the cycle. The same thing applies to why are you using a high concentration product if you don't need to? Or why don't you use a high concentration product because you've got a multiple steroidal stack, etc., etc. You have more options. You are not restricted. I can think maybe, Steve, of our listeners, perhaps only the markets, and I think specifically of the Australian market, where it's so difficult to get steroids into Australia and or manufactured in the kind of way that we're talking about, that you might be restricted in your options. It's certainly the case back in the day when I first come to PEDs. You know, what I might have an idea of what I want to use, but I might have to wait to get that product. I couldn't start until the product had arrived in the country or whatever. That's no longer the case. You can swap things out, you can change things around, and certainly labs like ParaPharma provide you with other options. You are not restricted. Sometimes when we read people talking about it, that's what literally the lab that you've already used, the source that you've already used has other options. You don't have to do just that.
so
Because it's
ParaPharma, yeah, and Mobster talk about ParaPharma. ParaPharma also does a great job across the board, even with their
yes,
high concentration gear, to
yes,
make sure they're limiting post-injection pain as much as they can. So you really,
absolutely.
so really with ParaPharma, if you're gonna try something with high concentration or a blend or something, go with ParaPharma and you'll notice the difference. Go with your buddy at the gym, you could have a problem. We'll get into that second. Now, some other tips, which I am not particularly a fan of, but some guys have posted this over the forum over the years. Some people like to they'll do homemade synthol, and what they'll do is they'll spot inject certain muscles when they're dealing with something that has high post-injection pain, something that
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
and so they'll do it that way. I've heard all kinds of stories of mixing certain things at home and blah, blah, blah. I'm not personally a fan of doing that, but I'm just saying some people have done that over the years. Also, that is a good point. Some muscles don't like to be injected. And again, it goes back to my point earlier that I just talked about. If the muscle doesn't like to be pinned, don't force it to be pinned. We got to get
Yeah,
away from this macho masculinity bullshit where, well, I'm going to do what I want to do. Fuck my muscle. No, if your muscle is saying, I don't like to be injected, then don't inject it. It's that simple. My left quad hates being injected, but my right quad is okay with the injected. So I don't
let me
inject with
expand
my
on that
left.
for a second, please,
That
Steve.
simple.
Let me give you an expansion on that. Okay, so again, this comes down to your aims, what you want from the cycle, and so on and so forth. And especially if you're competing, we know that those kind of individuals, a multiple steroidal stack or competing, requiring multiple products to go in at certain points of time with insulin and growth hormone and everything else. Oh my God, I'm injecting 5, 6 times a day, blah, blah, blah. Okay, right. So one of the ways around that might be a high volume of liquid. Well, I wouldn't want to put 2 mil, for example, into, say, my bicep, but I'm perfectly happy putting 2 mil into my quads or my glutes, especially if I use more than 2 mil, for example. And so, and there's another thing, Steve. We could, and there are videos of this kind of thing on YouTube, and I've certainly seen diagrams, and I believe there's a couple of story order books with photographs where they say, oh, for example, this is where you should inject on your pec, this is where you should inject on your rear delt, this is where you should inject on this muscle, and so on and so forth. And that may be the perfect site for 90% of you. But for example, when we used to aspirate, which we no longer do, it was literally a way of making sure that you wasn't injecting into a vein. But for the most part, the places that we inject into now, that's not really an issue, so we don't see aspiration as much. The same thing applies to nerves and where they're situated. You might be injecting, for example, where you've got scars in the muscle. You may have a nerve cluster there that the rest of us do not, and so on, right? So again, it doesn't have to be in exactly the same place at exactly the same time, and so on and so forth. And it might literally be for, I'm a good example again, Steve. I like to inject into my outer quad. And there's a line between almost my thigh bicep, my bicep femoris, and the muscle on the side there. The muscle on the side tends to be, even as I'm sitting here doing this show, kind of rigid and hard to push into, was just underneath in the gap between the bicep, thigh bicep, and the outer muscle of the quad is a space, which is perfectly fine for me to inject to, but it's literally a quarter of an inch, half an inch either way, Steve. And I might show someone, helping them, this is where I inject, but they might find that where they do it, they've got tension there. Literally sitting down, for example, there are silly little things. I can give you another analogy, Steve, to expand on that with regards to. I would do back in the day with my leg extended, and I would have to find a way that I could relax the muscles on the side of my thigh versus if I sat in a different position and I was moving around on the chair, well, then my muscles are slightly under tension. And that's just a silly little tiny thing. Everything else being equal again. Literally, if my muscles were relaxed, and Steve talks about injecting yourself when you've just had a hot shower or bath and you're kind of relaxed and sitting there, it's much easier to give yourself an injection because you're kind of chilled versus me rushing in from something, sitting down and jabbing my quad, oh, I need to do it now, and being slightly tense. And it's that much harder for me to push the pin in, that much more uncomfortable. And again, that's nothing to do with the high milligrams per mil. It's literally that it would make no difference. I'm still going to get post-injection pain just because I haven't relaxed properly or not quite putting the injection where it needs to go. And yet that will vary from person to person. So even with that, you're going to have some issues. Now, you would get issues again on top if you have any issues with high milligram per milliliter products. So I could be super relaxed and still have an issue. But I'm definitely going to get post-injection pain, Steve, if I'm not relaxed and I'm using the high milligram per milliliter. And that just comes down, as you say, the spot injection, the muscle, and the volume of liquid you're putting into that muscle. It's a lot easier for me or anybody else to put high milligram per milliliter and or high volume into my glute than, for example, we do, especially if I'm an average size individual, which I'm not, into a relatively small muscle like the bicep by comparison. And that's just a technique and the sheer amount you're putting in, never mind whether it's a high density product. So back to you again, Steve.
Yeah, and another thing too, there's been people like, look, I'll use fishing as an example. And Mobster, has hobbies. Mobster has hobbies with photography. There's been guys who have been fishing for 10 years, 15, 20 years who still suck at it. And there's people who've been doing photography for 10, 15, 20 years who suck at it. Why? Because they refuse to educate themselves. They refuse to, get better at it. And they keep doing the wrong things over and over and over. If you go fishing and everyone else is catching fish and you're the only one not catching fish, maybe you're not using the right bait. Maybe you're not using the right hook. Maybe you're not using the right. If you go do photography and your photography is shit, and then your buddy also does photography, he's posting these beautiful pictures on Instagram, maybe you need to work on getting a better camera. Maybe you need to work on the way you hold the camera. I don't know. My point is, injecting is the same thing. If you're not willing to get better at it and learn from trial and error, then you're not going to get better. So that's a big thing. There's been people that have been injecting for 20 years who don't know how to properly inject. And that's because they refuse to get better at it. So injecting is not something like from day one, you're going to just inject and it's going to be the best thing ever. No, it's going to take practice and it's going to take learning from your mistakes.
Think of the Lake Boston Royd, Steve, when one of his videos back in the day, especially when he was going by the name of Mr. 3cc, he did one when he comes out of the gym, he goes over to his pickup in the car park and he stands down the side of the pickup and jabs 3cc into his quad. There's a certain macho aspect, almost machismo macho, borderline or some sort of weird sexual thing where people were like jabbing randomly, like I don't give a fuck. And if it hurts, motherfucker. But then everything goes.
So if you keep if you inject in the locker room at the gym, which is one of the most dirty places on earth,
please, man,
and you keep getting infections, maybe you should learned that maybe it's not a good idea to inject in a dirty environment like that. Maybe, you know, so there's things you got to get better at when it comes to
Yes.
injecting. So this is something you got to work back. And look, some of you are slow learners, and that is what it is. Everybody learn. I used to be a teacher. There's always those kids, those, you know, I have a class of 30 people. There's always those 4 or 5 kids who are the slow learners, and there's the 4 or
Yep.
5 kids who are the fast learners with everything, no matter what. And those, I got to do a better job of teaching those 4 or 5 kids who are the slower learners to catch up. And you might be a slower learner in this particular thing, but you might be a fast learner when it comes to, you know, doing something else with computers or something. You know what I'm saying? So everybody's
Use
different.
that analogy again, Steve. If you've had great results from a particular steroid that had a certain milligram per milliliter thing, and every single cycle you've ever done, you've always put on a few pounds of muscle, you've always felt fantastic, you've always looked great in the mirror, but every single time you've done it, it's stung, it's because you're doing something you don't need to do, or you've got stuck in a particular place or whatever else. Use the analogy that Steve used earlier on. I know when I've taken a good picture. Equally, I take a bunch of rubbish pictures. I'm old school. I had to fucking go and get the rolls of film developed back in the day, Steve. And I'd be lucky if I got 4 good shots of a roll of 24. It's a lot easier with digital cameras. But equally, I understand I know what I'm doing. So it's that particular thing. Let's move on now to some of the options that we're referring to here, Steve, because there are some great options.
Let me do a couple. Let's talk about the ParaPharma, the high concentration options from ParaPharma. And as I said earlier, you shouldn't fear these because ParaPharma does a fantastic job of producing these compounds and reducing the post-injection pain. So if you do want to go the high concentration route, these are the options. And I'm going to do a couple that I have a lot of experience with. And the Mobster is going to do the next couple that he has a lot of experience with. So Boldo 500, I love this. This is equipoise. And I love equipoise. I'm one of the most pro equipoise people out there. I love its versatility. You can use it to cut, bulk. You can use it for cardio. You can use it for athletic purposes. You can use it if you want to go, you know, mountain climb or go bicycling or go do yoga or go kayaking. It's a lot of options. And it's great for bodybuilders and power lifters and everything, right? And it's a mild steroid. So I love this stuff. This Boldo 500 is fantastic because you can inject this 1 cc every 10 days and you'll have about 400 milligrams floating in your body per week on average. That's a good amount of equipoise to use. So this is a great option. And at the end of the day, 1 cc every 7 to 10 days. If you do it every 7 days, then you're taking 500 milligrams a week. If you're doing it every 10 days, you're doing about 400 milligrams a week. That's it. You can just run it solo, or you can stack in a little testosterone with it. You can mix in a little bit of the ParaPharma testosterone SIP or testosterone E, and you've got yourself a good cycle right there. You could also add in some ParaPharma T-Bowl. You can add in some ParaPharma Anavar if you want to do like a cutting stack or a recomp stack. That would work fantastic as well. So this is a really, really good option for ParaPharma. I like this one. The next one is Sustanon 350. Now, usually Sustanon comes in 250. So they did it with 350. And this is a pretty cool compound, Mobster. So this is a little different. In this one, they have a testosterone E, 200 milligrams, testosterone SIP, 100 milligrams, testosterone probe, 50 milligrams. This is very different than the Sustanon that you see out there because the other Sustanons have 4 esters. This just has 3. So it adds up to 350. So this is a really cool mix. And it's more intermediate esters because this doesn't have that long ester that's common with Sustanon 250, that long decanate ester. So this is something that you can inject once a week or twice a week, and it would be a very, very good one to use. So with this one, let's say you wanted to do 350 a week, you would do 1 cc, you know, and you're good. Let's say you wanted to do 2 a week. I would do half a cc twice a week, or you could do 1 cc twice a week, and that would give you 700 milligrams. So it really depends on what you want. And when it comes to this, you can stack it with anything. You can do it with Primo, with Equipoise, with Tren, with anything. You can stack it with different orals. ParaPharma has you covered across the board. Really, really impressive setup on these. Go ahead, Mobster.
As Steve says, I'm a huge fan of Sustanon, and I could absolutely see me combining it. I'm going to talk about the next two. The one I would combine it with, and I'm going to do this also about face, Steve, is I would probably be looking at something like their Decan 500 product, which is nandrolone decanate, And as I've said already on multiple shows, I'm such a fan for bulking and the strength gains that I can get from the Sustanon 350 and the Deccan 500. It would absolutely blow me the fuck up. And perhaps I might add in, Steve, here, and only for the free testosterone advantage that you and I have discussed on a couple of recent shows, a little bit of Mastron or Provaron. I think probably Provaron because that's a better option for me. And again, it's a nice low dose on a daily basis. In fact, I'll be kind of fascinated to see how we'd get on with either of these products. If I'm correct in thinking that they are producing a professional product that's going to sting far less than the past, I could see me doing something, for example, with Steve, 1 mil of each per week. It's still 900 milligrams total, which is about where I would want to be nowadays. They've done slightly more than that recently, but this would be great for 1 jab a week. You're talking about relatively long acting, so that would be great for me. And 25 milligrams a day of Provaron to get even more out of it. In fact, probably arguably, Steve, because the cycle that I'd done in the not too distant past was a little bit more in terms of total milligram, but with something to boost the free testosterone, I'd love to get in the similar effect to me taking 1,050, which is what I was doing before, this 900 milligrams total. So that would be absolutely amazing. The other one would be, and I've talked about this, something that I, for whatever reason, never got great gains on, but my buddies absolutely love. And I can see him being all over this. And that's their Test E400, which is testing Namphate 400 milligrams. And all my buddies back in the day were strength training or strongman competing athletes. And they loved testing Namphate almost as a base. I won't say a test base as such, but they were doing other things. So, for example, let's go back to my Susteca thing just for a second, Steve. My preference would be for 8 to 10 weeks. And I've had great results running 8 to 10 weeks into a competition, get to the size of a house, be strong like a bull. And in those cases, I think certainly when in the past, when I was competing regularly, win every fucking time. So the biggest, strongest motherfucker, or if not the biggest, big enough and strong enough to win. So that was the one there. My buddies, I just loved to argue as to what else they were doing, whether that be halo testing, for example, or something similar. But for them, they loved testing Namphate. And as an example, again, we're talking about similar lengths of cycle here, Steve. I don't think anybody, I was never keen on the 16 weeks. So I think in 10 to 12 weeks for some competitions, especially if you're doing competition back to back, as is the case with certain competitions at certain times a year for them again. But for the most part, 10 to 12 weeks, I think will probably be overall. And again, what you're looking for from what you're doing kind of helps us give you guidance on the length of cycle that you'll be on. Typically, I would say, Steve, I think the average steroid user, you're looking, even if you're not competing, I would say the average is around 12 weeks. And again, this is going to come down to less frequency of pinning with the Namphate. It's kind of medium/long. So high dosage. What would I be looking at here? I think average testosterone user now, Steve, between 600 and 800 milligrams, which is 1.5 to 2 mil per week. And you would be kind of combining that with something else, completely dependent on your aims, requirements, and needs for what you're doing. So, for example, if you're a bodybuilder and you're relatively lean, I could see you using Mastron, which also enhances the free testosterone. I certainly see you doing other combinations there, Steve. Test and trend would be a great cycle, quite aggressive. And their trend's not too high dosage, but again, you're using a high dose testosterone in. The other thing which is interesting here, Steve, is again, once you have a sort of knowledge of what works for you. Now, my buddies love test and Namphate, so they would know that using the Test 400 product is going to work for them versus someone who says, well, I don't know. And we would say, well, you can take that out and put something else in. So you've got really comes down to, I know that testing Namphate works for me. I'm going to use the higher dose product because it requires less pinning, but I know I'm going to get great results. And then obviously the aim of your cycle. So what would you throw in there, Steve? Can you think of a cycle, say, for example, just a bodybuilding cycle? What would you add to testing Namphate 400?
So I would do test Namphate 400. I would do either a half a cc once a week or 1 cc once a week. And I would do some EQ with it if you wanted to bodybuild. And that would be a good, nice, mild bulker. If you wanted to cut, then I would do the same thing with the testosterone, but I would do some Anavar with it. And that would be a good little cutting stack, and you would have some really, really good results with it. So it's really versatile. There's a lot of different options you can do.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
Less injecting, less milliliters going in. It means more likely to be able to put it into a smaller muscle if you want to. And you're using it with a hardener, you're using it with a strengthener, EQ, and so on and so forth. So there's definitely loads of options out there. But I mean, the thing that I think comes most out of any of these options, and we'll discuss a couple more, is literally that you are having to inject less. There are people, as an aside, Steve, that are, for want of a better phrase, pin happy. And I touched upon this on shows. I know people that have been happy, meaning they won't go to the gym unless they've given themselves a jab. That's their way their psychology works. I'm the other direction. The less amount I have to sit there and put the needle in for suits me down to the ground. So I can definitely see me starting to lean towards the higher volume products simply because it requires less. And I can think, for example, the longer acting esters means one jab a week instead of multiple jabs, and so on and so forth. What other options? Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so a good one too with the Deca M500, if you want to go that route. So what I would do is I would run it once every 7 to 14 days. Remember, it's a really long ester. So if you're going to do 1 cc, you could do it every 7 days. If you wanted to do 2 cc's, you can do 2 cc's every 2 weeks, and it'd be in your system. Now, you remember, it's going to take a while to peak in your system. That doesn't mean you can't stop the cycle after 8 or 10 weeks. You can do whatever you want. But if you really want to get the most out of it, you want to push it 12, 14 weeks, even 15 weeks. This way you can enjoy that peaking in the system, because it will take 8 or 9 weeks to even peak in your system. But one of the recommendations that I recommend using with Proviron, and really you can is Proviron, and you can use Proviron on any of these stacks we're talking about. The nice thing about the ParaPharma Proviron is that it's affordable and it comes in an oral form. So you can literally pop the oral and do 25 milligrams a day, and it will benefit your entire cycle because it binds the SHBG really well. So, Mobster, you want to touch on that a bit, and let's get into the Deca Test 400 and the Boldo Test 400.
So something Steve and I discussed in a recent show, and we was provoked into putting the discussion together, and it was one of those where, as Steve said, in terms of getting better at what you do, we went out and paid way more attention to the idea of having more free testosterone floating around your system. In other words, more bang for your buck, to put it crudely. So the idea of Proviron or Masteron as an enhancer, not necessarily, for example, and I've argued about this on other shows, Masteron, you should be this percentage of body fat, it's a great muscle hardener. It still is. But what we were looking at here was the ability to, as this Steve, bind to SHBG and enhance the amount of free testosterone that was available for you to do what you wanted to do, i.e. you get a better effects from the steroid. So, for example, let's just use it here, Steve. They do a product called Decatest 400, which is nandrolone decanate, 200 milligrams, and testosterone enanthate, 200 milligrams. And we've touched on both of these earlier on. Now, imagine you're taking that, but you're only getting, and there's a big side argument about the percentage of available to you for your body to do what it needs to do, typically anabolically build up your muscle. Now, if we take Proviron 25 milligrams or a small amount of Masteron and we enhance that percentage, we increase what's available for anabolic purposes, we've basically got more bang for our buck. We've made the cycle better. It's still better if you've got a lower percentage of body fat for muscle building purposes. That's still the case. But even without that, and you can find this with blood tests, and this is the thing that we did on that show, Steve, as you know, we were literally freeing up more testosterone, and that has to be something you should pay attention to. Absolutely, Steve. And again, look at the ratios here: 200 milligrams, 200 milligrams. I love Deca anyway already. If I got on with enanthate, this would be perfect for me. I can certainly see my strongman buddies absolutely loving this. Cycling dosage in, two injections a week, Steve. That's going to take you to 800 milligrams. That was around what I was kind of doing anyway. It's absolutely bloody perfect. And again, I'm pretty sure a ParaPharma producing a solid product here. Move on to the next thing, Steve.
Yeah, so Deca Test 400, it's one of their blends, and you touched on it. So one of the couple oral options that I would stack into here if you wanted to enhance the bulking and the strength aspect is you could do the ParaPharma Debol or the ParaPharma Anadrol. And that would really do a good job of enhancing your size further. And Anadrol does two things. It not only helps with the bulking, but it also provides that DHT balance. So if you do go with the Debol, you may want to lower the dose of that and add in some proviron. Always with an nandrolone, with DECA or NPP, always use proviron or any DHT with it to help balance things. Now with the Boldo and Test 400 blend that they have, a good addition to that stack would be ParaPharma Anabol or ParaPharma Turonabol. And that would be a good recomping action or lean muscle gain option. So you go that route. So both those blends are good, Mobster, for people who like using an even ratio of testosterone in their cycle. I like keeping testosterone low, so these blends would not be something that I'd be interested in. But a lot of you out there, you like using the same amount of testosterone in each of your cycles. You like to have that testosterone base. You like the way it affects your mood and your libido and all that stuff. You're a good reactor to it. You don't mind the water retention. You go that route. And then finally, let me just add this. ParaPharma also has the ancillaries that you'll need. So if you're running testosterone, dianabol, or anything else that aromatizes, you can use. They've got 3 AIs. They've got the Aromacin, the Arimidex, and the Letro, and all 3 are excellent. I would go with Aromacin. That'd be the number 1 option. Number 2 option would be Arimidex. Number 3 option in an emergency situation would be Letro, which is a good one to have on hand, but it would be a last resort that I would use. But they have you covered. They also have you covered when it comes to PCT. So, Mobster, why don't we touch on why we like ParaPharma? And you ready for that? Let me start that off, and I'll kind of let you take over. So, we talked about on this podcast, earlier on the podcast about using proper gear and how underground labs are dominating, especially
yes.
American. The underground labs are dominating the American market for many, many years until the last 5 years. Now we have brands like ParaPharma that have come on. They've been around for at least 12 years, but really they've come on over the past 5 years, and now they've built a strong customer base. So one of the ways you can avoid post-injection pain and problems with injecting and infections is using high quality gear. So don't buy low quality gear, stick to high quality gear. So underground labs from your buddy at the gym or the buddy in the trailer who's brewing it, they're never perfectly sterile. Okay. These aren't educated people who are chemists who went to school for this. They're just guys who like blowing the chemistry lab up. Okay. So they know, the owners know it. What they do, they make mistakes. They add a ton of alcohol to the vial to cover up their mistakes, and that adds more post-injection pain. So that's a problem. Another thing is not using sterile oil. So a lot of times they don't do that either. And a lot of times what they'll do is they'll high dose their products. So they'll overdose their products, which leaves no room for oil. And that leaves a ton of alcohol inside the vial. So it's going to hurt like hell. The ratios are going to be off. And, at the end of the day, you've got to have some skill if you're going to reconstitute your gear, if you're going to make gear from your bathtub, whatever, from your place, you've got to do it. And it takes a professional that knows what they're doing. So ParaPharma actually has professional labs, legitimate labs, professional, educated professionals who actually went to school for this stuff, who are making these products, and you're going to get the proper concentration. So that's the number 1 reason for me, Mobster, using ParaPharma. Why don't you touch on your reasons?
I can think of some bad examples and then talk about good examples, right? So we've seen videos too in recent years of people talking to the camera. I think one was on Lad Bible when he's in his kitchen making steroids. I've told the story of another one where he's in a garage with Dave Crosslin and they're zapping the product in a microwave to help dissolve the powder into the solution. And he's in a garage, Steve, with a little coffee table and the microwave's on the coffee table and the jar with the solution in, and how the excipient, I believe, is added to it, stirs it with a glass swizzle stick, and then they put it in the microwave on camera. Now, just to buy the fucking scales to weigh up the milligrams per milliliter, the minimum I've heard price-wise, Steve, is $2,000 just to have the proper scales. And that's probably a used set of the scales that you would require for a pharmaceutical company. And they can be a lot more than that, Steve. Tens of thousands, crazy money. A production line for a single product can easily be on the order of $250,000. I will touch upon more than that, right? When we talked about why ParaPharma has lasted this long. It's lasted this long because labs come and go. I've been around this game long enough to see labs come and go. You go one day and ask for a particular product and that brand's not available anymore because they got raided, because they got busted, because people simply stopped buying their products. So to last 10, 12, 13, I believe it's coming up 13, 14 years with ParaPharma, Steve, is simply that you produce solid products continuously and you've got built up a reputation that people appreciate. It's out there in the world. People are getting results. You could come on our forums and check out logs of people that are running ParaPharma products. I've run ParaPharma products. I've done a stack on this. I've got a diary online. You can come and check out. You can see what I wrote about the results that I got. You don't have to take my word for it. I'm not going to sit down and fake 4 weeks of how I got on or whatever else. I've talked about how on a cut, using their Cut 150 product, my waist went down and is still down. And it was in October, Steve. And we're doing it's what, June tomorrow as we do this show. So I'm down 7, 8 months and I haven't gone back up in the waist size using their product they could do a cut with. So I can personally recommend the results I got from their product. I can talk about the quality of the product just on that basis alone. And then, like I said, ParaPharma included, just literally how companies operate, what they're producing, the stuff that they put out there, certificates of analysis and lab tests you can get online, independent lab testing, personal results, multiple, not just myself, multiple logs on the forum of people that are running ParaPharma products via one of the resellers and how that means something. Think about anything that you guys buy, any car, tomato sauce, anything. Why do you buy certain brands? Why do you go to certain makes and models of cars? Because you know the consistent quality of that car. You know that if there's any issues, you can take it back to the company that you bought it from, the agent or whatever. Why do you go to the same mechanic all the time? Because he does a great job and charges a great price. That's what it's like in PEDs. That's exactly how it should be. And as I said again at the beginning of the show, we are super familiar just with the history of the iron game and specifically the history of PEDs when every single thing in America was coming across the border from Mexico. And you literally could go over there and buy stuff, but you had to take it because you might get busted at the border and all that kind of fucked up stuff. None of that applies anymore. You want a company that produces solid products at a good price that you know works, that has the least post-injection pain, that even a high volume per milligram per milliliter products don't cause the pain that they used to do in the past, that they're not fucking up the benzoalkyl ratios, and but they produce products, all the labs, but especially today with ParaPharma, are producing products that used to sting in the past that don't sting anymore. And they do that because they know what the fuck they're doing, using the right kind of oils, the right ratio of benzoyl alcohol, and they're producing products that you're asking for. Like I said, there's a lot of stuff out there. We're all interested, Steve, I think, as I've summarized, in what you want, the reasons why you might be using a high milligram per milliliter product. Are you competing? Do you like less pinning? Have you used ParaPharma products? What was the results? Did you get post-injection pain? Have you fucked up even like that pro bodybuilder with the wrong syringe sizes and not having the knowledge that you should have had and all those kind of things, Steve? Anything else before we finish the show?
Yeah, and when it comes to when it comes to what you're putting in your body, a lot of us, all you guys and gals that listen to the show, you're going out, you're buying, instead of buying the grain finished beef, you're buying the grass-fed beef. Instead of buying the low quality, tortured and disease-ridden eggs from chickens that are disease-ridden, you're buying the high quality pastured eggs and pastured chicken where they're outside in the sun, they're getting the vitamins, they're eating their seeds and bugs off the ground. You're going the extra mile, to put quality into your body. You're not putting chemicals and pesticides in your house so you can breathe that in. You make sure you filter your water at home.
Yes.
You go to extra
all
mile.
these things all those things help.
But then when it comes to injecting, you're like, well, I'm just going to buy gear off my buddy at the gym. So we got to be smarter because you buy the gear from your buddy at the gym and you take it, you could end up literally losing a muscle from an infection. You can get extremely sick. We've seen that over the years. So it's very, very important. We've seen guys on the forum once a week or twice a week come on and say I had to go to the emergency room and get my infection drained because I used gear from this source or this brand. And it's like, what are
Yes.
you guys doing? We have approved sources. They've been vetted. They've been checked. And
Yep.
ParaPharma is a brand that we've vetted and we've checked very, very closely. And we know that their products are correct. This is why the best resellers in the world are using ParaPharma in 2024. And this is why we trust them to put in our body. So their orals and their injectables are going to be fantastic.
Our members have independently tested some of our approved sources, deliberately trying to catch them out by their own admission and couldn't do it. ParaPharma was on that list of products that got tested. I know, like Steve said, I've seen the photographs where people have had to go to ER, and that doesn't happen anymore because all sources realize that they're to up their game. People didn't give a fuck. They just wanted your money. And people was buying from the trunks of cars back in the day. Doesn't happen anymore. I'll use a phrase I've used on other shows before we finish it. You've never had it so good. The idea that you could go and buy a dodgy gear, have infections, stung every time it was used, etc., was accepted back in the day, Steve. We almost said that's the price we got to pay. Don't have to do that no more. Companies like ParaPharma have just got simply better at it, more professional, and they get to last. Companies that are shit don't last over a decade, Steve. They just don't. And when we go on the approved sources, we've literally tested those products ourselves. We've had people make random sales. And then, as I say just now, we've had literally members now with enough disposable income to be able to afford to do this, buy products from our approved sources. One product from this one, two from that one, and so on, and ParaPharma included. And they couldn't catch anybody out. They weren't just relying on the test and the results that companies like ParaPharma show you. And you can go onto their website and check, or you can contact a reseller and ask about tests and so on and so forth, certificates of analysis, what batch number, when was this tested, is this a legit product? You never used to be able to do any of those things. You can, but this particular person in question went and brought probably the best part of $1,000 worth of product, spent a couple of $1,000 getting them tested, and he couldn't catch any of them out. He said, I was expecting at least two. And again, ParaPharma was on that list, not one product found. But some are obviously going to be better than others. And ParaPharma is growing day on day, year on year, into a big name brand. If they're not already, Steve, not just on our family forums, but over multiple forums where some companies get bigged up more than others. ParaPharma is given a name across all of those forums, multiple times, multiple places, multiple people, different users, etc., etc. And just on our forums alone, tens of users, hundreds of users, and certainly tens of logs that you can check out and say, what the hell, this is a solid ass product coming from a good company. Please note, we are not doctors and opinions are ours. It's our view and based on our experience and views on the topic. A podcast are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.